beast rising from the sea, often identified in history with Antichrist. Another beast forcing people on earth to worship an image of the first beast and take the mark of this beast on their forehead. And then the number 666. Chapter 13 in Revelation is certainly not a chapter without famous or contentious aspects. Welcome to another tidbit from the book of Revelation. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. Let's look at the chapter. The basic content is clear enough. You have two monsters, two beasts presented. The first, the beast from the sea, which dies. It gets wounded to death. And then you have a second beast from the earth, which forces people to worship an image of the first beast, which died and rose again. And that leads us to the question, but did it really die? When you read the various translations, you may not be sure that that is actually what happens. Listen here to English Revised Version. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. Seemed to have a mortal wound. Now, it actually died. The phrase that is used is identical to the phrase used about the slain lamb in chapter 5, verse 6. There is no doubt in the Greek text that this beast died and it rose again. Now, one other detail is worth mentioning, because when you look at the description in the second part of the chapter, it is said in verse 12 about the second beast that it exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose mortal wound was healed. A similar phrase is repeated a couple of verses later, and it tells us that each of the heads actually is identical with the beast itself. So when one of the heads was killed, it was the beast itself which died. So these 7 heads are in history following each other sequentially. So they are successive in regard to chronology. They describe 7 periods of time. So the beast really dies and rises again, which tells us this is not an individual figure, but it is certainly a caricature, an imitation of Christ. Look at the parallel. In the description of the beast in chapter 13, in the first part, it is said that one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound. While reading again from the English Standard Version, people are following, they marveled, they followed the beast, and then it said that the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. So here you have a beast which exercises its authority for 42 months, 3.5 years, then it dies, and then it rises again. This is an imitation of Christ. This beast is Christ-like. It makes an abuse, you could say, of the very core of the Christian message, that is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So this is a little about the content. Now look at the context. In the previous chapter, the heavenly court ruled in favor of Christ and his saints, and the devil is now angry. So what we have is the final battle of dominion, the battle for the kingdom, the battle for the kingdom of God. And we are preparing the way for the last battle. In this fight for dominion, you have 3 monsters on one side, that is the dragon, Satan, and then these 2 beasts. the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. And in the next chapter we will see that they are fighting a slain, a bleeding lamb. Now imagine Steven Spielberg making a movie out of this. You have these three mighty monsters and you have a bleeding lamb. Who's going to win the battle? This is a paradox, because the lamb is the conqueror, the one who is victorious. Now, let's look at not only content and context, but also potential Old Testament background. And here's a very interesting phenomenon. As we read in the beginning of the chapter, I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, and so on. The beast I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's. Its mouth was like a lion's mouth. Now, for anyone who at the time knew and now knows about the Old Testament, you immediately think Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, the prophet sees 4 beasts rise out of the sea, and they are like a lion, a beast, and a leopard, and then there's a 4th beast. And these are the beasts that are now represented here in this animal. And as we move on in Daniel 7, the last beast, the iron beast, has a unique feature. The power of that beast will be represented by a little horn. And actually you could say that the description here of the beast from the sea in Revelation 7 in many ways is identifying this power with the little horn of Daniel 7. Many of the features are repeated. It speaks haughtily. It speaks about the name of God, and it mocks the name of God. The period even is exactly the same as is mentioned in Daniel 7. So here you have similarities. There's another similarity, another link back to the Old Testament, especially Daniel 3, because you remember the story about the friends of Daniel who were forced by Nebuchadnezzar to worship. Actually, they didn't do it, but they should have been, according to Nebuchadnezzar, worshipping an idol, an image. This is in the story repeated, telling about the end time challenge of false worship. But there's a link more. As you look at the content of this chapter, you will find that the law of God is very much in focus. The first commandment of the law is broken, worshiping another God. The second, making an image of a God and worshipping. And the third one, that is taking the name of God in vain or mocking the name of God. All these 3 commandments are referred to in the description of the history in this text. And the 4th commandment is quoted in the next chapter, chapter 14. We will naturally return to that next time. So the law is central. In the battle for dominion, for the kingdom, you have a fake law. And that leads to the mark of the beast. Because in the end of the chapter, it is described how the beast from the sea will force people to take a mark of the beast on their forehead and on their hand. Let's read. In chapter 13, 16 and onwards, it also causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy and sell and so on. Now, going to the Old Testament, there is only one place, one text, where you have a mark on the forehead and on the hand. Let's read it. Deuteronomy, verse 4-9 in chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to the children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. In other words, when the first listeners, the target audience of the book of Revelation, heard this mark of the beast on the forehead and on their hand, they would immediately think the law of God, this time a false law, that is, a mockery, an alternative law, that is, something that breaks the very foundation of the law of God itself, that is, the Ten Commandments. This text in the Old Testament is what Jews would call the Shema, the great core of the Old Testament law. And that brings us then to the last tidbit. I cannot leave this chapter without saying something about the number 666. Much speculation has gone into this number. And I'm not sure that I know exactly what it means, but I know a lot of what it does not mean, because people have got it to mean almost anything. Basically, remember the principle. This is only one out of many features that identify the beast of the chapter. So, don't look at the number only, look at all the features. But it is commonly stated that 666 is almost short of 777. That sounds good. Let me try something I haven't done before. Let me show you something. Here you have the Greek and the numbers. Hexacosia, hexaconta, hex. Sounds a little like each other, doesn't it? But you know, the Greeks did not write 666 with 3 identical letters, and they did not write 777 with 3 identical letters. You see them here. 666 was written with chi, xi, and sigma, and 777 was written with psi, omicron, and zeta. So this idea that 666 is close to 777 is not as obvious. So what is it? Here it's about wisdom. And sometimes wisdom is to be silent. The identification of the beast from the sea is based on all the features of the chapter. Thank you for listening to Tidbit from Revelation 13.